The 1970s gave us cinematic masterpieces that redefined filmmaking forever, but it also birthed some of the most despised, controversial, and critically savaged films in Hollywood history. What happens when visionary directors lose their minds, studios greenlight disasters, or audiences reject what critics praise? The decade that brought us The Godfather also unleashed movies so hated they destroyed careers, bankrupted studios, and left audiences demanding refunds. These aren't just bad movies, they're cultural flashpoints that sparked riots, lawsuits, and debates that still rage today. Number 14. At Long Last Love, 1975. Peter Bogdanovich thought he could turn Burt Reynolds and Sybil Shepherd into Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and the result was one of the most spectacular disasters of the decade. This Cole Porter musical was filmed entirely with live singing, no dubbing, and audiences immediately realized why that's usually a terrible idea. Reynolds and Shepherd couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, yet Bogdanovich forced them to croon through 16 Porter classics while dancing like they had two left feet. Critics didn't just pan it, they actively celebrated its failure, with one reviewer calling it the most misguided vanity project since Cleopatra nearly destroyed Fox. The film cost $4 million and earned less than $1 million at the box office, effectively ending Bogdanovich's hot streak after The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon. What made audiences truly hate it was the sheer arrogance of the enterprise. Bogdanovich was so convinced of his genius that he held the premiere at Radio City Music Hall, expecting a triumph. Instead, people walked out in droves, laughing at what was supposed to be romantic and sophisticated. The director eventually recut the film and removed several musical numbers, essentially admitting defeat, but the damage was done. At Long Last Love became shorthand for directorial hubris, a cautionary tale about mistaking your stars for something they're not. The movie killed the 1930s musical revival before it could even begin, and Bogdanovich spent the rest of the decade trying to recover his reputation. Critics at the time said watching it was like being trapped at a karaoke bar where nobody knows they can't sing, except you paid money for the torture. Number 13. The Swarm, 1978. Irwin Allen, the master of disaster, thought he could make killer bees terrifying and instead created one of the most unintentionally hilarious movies ever made. With an all-star cast including Michael Caine, Catherine Ross, Richard Widmark, Henry Fonda, and Olivia de Havilland, The Swarm should have been a prestige disaster epic. Instead, it became a 2-hour slog of talented actors screaming at obviously fake bees while delivering dialogue so ridiculous it feels like parody. The plot involves African killer bees attacking Texas, and the military's brilliant response involves flamethrowers, missiles, and eventually setting an entire town on fire, which somehow makes things worse. Audiences hated it because it took itself deadly serious while being completely absurd. There's a scene where scientists debate bee psychology for 10 minutes while people are dying off-screen. The special effects were embarrassingly cheap, with bees clearly superimposed onto footage, sometimes not even matching the lighting or perspective. The movie cost $12 million and barely made half that back, effectively ending Allen's reign as the disaster king. Critics were merciless, with Roger Ebert calling it a bomb of Hindenburg proportions. What truly makes The Swarm hated is how it wastes its incredible cast on material beneath dinner theater. Michael Caine later joked he did it for the money and a nice vacation, but watching legends like Fonda look genuinely distressed by bad bee effects is painful. The film represents everything wrong with late 70s disaster movies, when studios thought they could throw money and stars at any ridiculous premise. It's not scary, not exciting, just tedious, and occasionally laugh-out-loud stupid. Number 12. Exorcist II: The Heretic, 1977. Taking one of the most terrifying and critically acclaimed horror films ever made and creating a sequel so bewildering that audiences rioted is an achievement in its own way. John Boorman directed this metaphysical mess that abandons everything that made the original work in favor of pretentious philosophical nonsense about good and evil. Linda Blair returns as Reagan, now a teenager working with a psychiatrist who uses a bizarre machine that somehow connects minds and allows them to revisit the original possession. Richard Burton shows up as a priest investigating the exorcism, looking like he's questioning every life choice that led him to this script. The movie was so hated that audiences literally threw things at the screen during its premiere, and Warner Brothers pulled it from theaters to recut it twice. Critics called it incoherent, boring, and an insult to the original, with some suggesting it might be the worst sequel ever made. What made people truly despise it was how seriously it took its own ridiculous ideas. There are scenes of Burton traveling to Africa to battle locusts controlled by demons, sequences that feel like a completely different movie got spliced in by accident. The film tried to be cerebral and ended up being incomprehensible, with dialogue so heavy-handed about the nature of evil that it feels like a film school thesis project gone wrong. At 74 minutes, Warner Brothers' recut couldn't save it, and the movie became a legendary disaster. Boorman later admitted he was dealing with personal tragedies during filming and probably shouldn't have made the movie. The Heretic doesn't just fail as a sequel, it actively damages the legacy of the original by existing. Number 11. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1977. H.G. Wells's classic novel about a mad scientist creating human-animal hybrids should have been perfect for 70s cinema, but this version starring Burt Lancaster and Michael York was a complete disaster that audiences actively rejected. Director Don Taylor turned the story into a plodding, poorly paced mess with creature effects that looked cheaper than television makeup. Lancaster plays Moreau with zero menace or charisma, just a vaguely irritated scientist who seems annoyed by his own creations. The Beast People, which should be the film's horrifying centerpiece, look like community theater rejects wearing unconvincing prosthetics and fur. Audiences hated how boring it was, taking a premise about the ethics of playing God and turning it into a talk-heavy slog with occasional glimpses of bad makeup. The film's biggest sin is making the concept dull, which seems almost impossible given the source material. Critics at the time noted that the 1932 Island of Lost Souls, made 45 years earlier, was infinitely superior in every way, despite having a fraction of the budget. There's a laughable scene where the Beast People chant their law, and it plays like a bad musical number rather than something unsettling. The movie cost $6 million and disappeared from theaters within weeks, barely making its money back. What truly makes this version hated is how unnecessary it feels. A remake that brings nothing new while stripping away everything that made the story compelling. Lancaster reportedly clashed with the director throughout production, and it shows in his disengaged performance. The film represents the worst kind of adaptation, one that has the rights to great material and absolutely no idea what to do with it. Number 10. The Betsy, 1978. Harold Robbins' novels were trash to begin with, but turning the Betsy into a movie resulted in something so sleazy and poorly made that audiences rejected it despite its cast of Oscar winners. Laurence Olivier, Catherine Ross, Tommy Lee Jones, and Robert Duvall star in this tale of sex, corruption, and the automobile industry that plays like a bad soap opera, stretched to 2 hours. Olivier, one of the greatest actors who ever lived, plays a car company patriarch in a performance so over the top it borders on self-parody. He spends the movie seducing younger women and spouting dialogue about the beauty of automobiles, like he's having a breakdown in real time. The plot involves corporate scheming, family betrayals, and an absurd amount of unnecessary bedroom scenes that feel exploitative and dated even by 70s standards. Audiences hated how seriously the film took itself while wallowing in trashy melodrama. Critics savaged it, with many suggesting that Olivier was embarrassing himself for a paycheck. There's a scene where he explains his passion for cars that's supposed to be profound, but plays like a commercial written by someone who's never driven. The movie cost $8 million and barely made its budget back, proving that star power couldn't save terrible material. What makes the Betsy particularly hated is how it wastes genuine talent on garbage, forcing great actors to deliver absurd lines with straight faces. It's the kind of movie that makes you wonder how everyone involved read the script and thought it was a good idea. The 70s had plenty of trashy movies, but few had the audacity to pretend they were important drama while being fundamentally sleazy exploitation. Number 9, Sorcerer, 1977. William Friedkin followed up The French Connection and The Exorcist with a remake of The Wages of Fear that audiences absolutely despised, not because it's bad, but because they expected something completely different. The title Sorcerer made people think it was a horror film about wizards, when it's actually a tense thriller about desperate men transporting unstable explosives through the jungle. The movie cost $22 million, an insane amount for 1977, and opened the same month as Star Wars, which buried it commercially. Audiences who did show up felt tricked by the title and marketing, walking out confused and angry. Critics were divided, with some recognizing its craftsmanship while others called it a pretentious mess. The film has no stars, taking 40 minutes before the main plot even begins, and features extended sequences of trucks driving through terrible conditions with minimal dialogue. What made contemporary audiences hate it was how punishing and bleak it is, offering no heroes, no hope, and an ending that feels like a cruel joke. The movie bankrupted its studio and destroyed Friedkin's hot streak, making him box office poison for years. There's brilliance in the filmmaking, particularly the bridge crossing sequence that's genuinely harrowing, but audiences in 1977 wanted escapism, not nihilistic existential dread. The production was a nightmare, with Friedkin shooting in multiple countries under terrible conditions, and that suffering translates to a viewing experience that feels hostile. Over time, Sorcerer has been re-evaluated as an underappreciated masterpiece, but in the 70s it was seen as the ultimate example of directorial ego-destroying commercial viability. People genuinely hated being tricked into watching what felt like homework instead of entertainment, and Friedkin paid the price for his uncompromising vision. Number 8, King Kong, 1976. Dino De Laurentiis spent $24 million remaking one of the most beloved films in cinema history and delivered something that split audiences down the middle, with a vocal contingent absolutely despising it. The movie relocated Kong to modern day, replaced stop motion with a man in an ape suit, and turned the story into a bizarre commentary on oil companies and environmentalism. Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange star in a version that takes itself deadly serious while featuring a giant mechanical Kong that barely worked and looks ridiculous in every scene it appears. Audiences who loved the original felt betrayed by the changes, while younger viewers found it boring and dated. The marketing was massive, with Kong's face on everything from lunchboxes to underwear, building expectations the film couldn't meet. Critics were harsh, with many calling it a soulless cash grab that missed everything that made the original magical. The mechanical Kong, which cost millions, appears in maybe 5 minutes of footage because it kept breaking down, forcing the filmmakers to use the suit and clever editing. There's a scene where Kong fights a giant snake that's unintentionally hilarious, with both creatures clearly fake. What made people truly hate this version was how it tried to be relevant by adding contemporary politics, but ended up feeling preachy and dull. The World Trade Center climax replaces the Empire State Building, which seemed edgy in 1976 but now feels bizarre for different reasons. The movie made money, but was considered a disappointment given its cost and hype. It represents the hubris of thinking you can improve on a classic by throwing money at it, and audiences punished that arrogance. The film's legacy is as a noble failure, but in the 70s it was just a failure. Number 7. The Driver, 1978. Walter Hill's existential crime thriller starring Ryan O'Neal was so minimalist and deliberately cool that audiences found it boring and pointless. The film features characters with no names, minimal dialogue, and extended car chase sequences that prioritize precision over excitement. O'Neill plays a getaway driver who's the best at what he does, pursued by a detective played by Bruce Dern, who becomes obsessed with catching him. That's basically the entire plot, stretched to 91 minutes of people staring intensely and occasionally driving cars really well. Contemporary audiences hated how detached and emotionless it felt, calling it pretentious and dull. The movie made almost no money and killed O'Neill's career as a leading man in serious films. Critics were similarly unimpressed, with many suggesting Hill mistook style for substance. What makes The Driver particularly frustrating is that it's technically well made, but it feels like watching someone play a video game rather than experiencing a story with real stakes. The characters are so deliberately archetypal, they become uninteresting, ciphers rather than people. There's a poker game scene that's supposed to be tense but plays like watching paint dry because we have no investment in anyone involved. The film has been re-evaluated over time as influential on later action cinema, particularly movies like Drive that wear the inspiration openly, but in 1978 it felt like an art film accidentally released as commercial entertainment. Audiences wanted personality and got mannequins acting out a heist movie template. Hill's vision was clear but completely at odds with what moviegoers expected, and they rejected it thoroughly. Number 6, Orca, 1977. After Jaws made hundreds of millions, every studio rushed to make their own killer animal movie, and Orca might be the worst of the knockoffs. Richard Harris stars as a fisherman who accidentally kills a pregnant killer whale, leading the male to seek elaborate revenge by systematically destroying his life. The whale kills his crew, burns down his house, and eventually lures him to the Arctic for a final confrontation that plays like Moby Dick, written by someone who skimmed the cliff notes while drunk. What made audiences truly despise this movie was how seriously it took its ridiculous premise. The film wants you to believe this whale is capable of complex reasoning and emotional sophistication, while showing it doing things no whale could possibly do. There's a scene where the orca causes an explosion by knocking over fuel tanks, which is absurd even by animal attack movie standards. Critics called it exploitative and stupid, with Roger Ebert giving it 1 star and suggesting people watch Jaws again instead. The movie cost $6 million and barely broke even, disappearing quickly from theaters. What pushes Orca into truly hated territory is how it tries to be profound about man's relationship with nature while featuring a whale biting off Bo Derek's leg in gruesome detail. You can't have it both ways, being both a serious ecological fable and a trashy exploitation film, but Orca tries and fails spectacularly. Harris looks embarrassed throughout, clearly doing it for money rather than artistic satisfaction. The film represents the absolute worst impulses of cash-grab filmmaking, taking what worked about Jaws and understanding none of it. It's not scary, not thoughtful, just boring, punctuated by occasional ridiculous whale attacks that look completely fake. Number 5, The Wiz, 1978. Taking The Wizard of Oz and relocating it to modern New York with an all-black cast should have been inspired, but this adaptation of the Broadway musical was a critical and commercial disaster that audiences actively rejected. Diana Ross, who was 34, plays Dorothy as a grown woman too scared to leave her apartment, which immediately kills any sense of wonder or discovery. Michael Jackson is the Scarecrow in one of his few film roles, and while he's committed, the material lets him down completely. The movie cost $24 million, an insane amount for a musical, and made only $13 million at the box office, nearly bankrupting Motown Productions. What made audiences hate The Wiz was how joyless and strange it felt, taking beloved songs and staging them in ways that sucked out any fun. The production design is aggressively weird, with the Emerald City reimagined as a disco nightclub and flying monkeys replaced by motorcycle gang members in bizarre costumes. Nothing feels magical, just odd and slightly uncomfortable. Critics savaged it, with many suggesting Ross was too old for the role, and the updated setting made no sense. Sidney Lumet directed, coming off serious dramas, and he brings absolutely no sense of whimsy or wonder to the material. There's a sequence in a subway station that's supposed to be scary, but plays like a bad music video. The film's failure effectively ended the black musical as a Hollywood genre for decades, which makes its legacy even more painful. What could have been a celebration of black artistry became a cautionary tale about misguided ambition. Audiences felt lectured to rather than entertained, and they stayed away in droves. The Wiz wanted to be important and ended up being a very expensive mistake. Number 4. A Wedding, 1978. Robert Altman's follow-up to Nashville was a sprawling ensemble comedy about an upper-class wedding that descends into chaos, and audiences found it insufferable and pointless. With 48 characters and no clear protagonist, the film asks viewers to keep track of multiple storylines involving people they have no reason to care about. The movie runs 2 hours and 5 minutes, which feels like 4 hours when you're watching rich people be horrible to each other with no consequences or resolution. Critics were mixed, with some appreciating Altman's ambition, while others called it self-indulgent garbage. The film made almost no money, proving that audiences had limits to how much aimless improvisation they'd tolerate. What makes A Wedding particularly hated is how smug it feels, like Altman is daring you to not find his observations about class and family profound. There are moments of dark comedy, but they're buried under endless scenes of characters talking over each other about nothing. The cast includes Carol Burnett, Desi Arnaz Jr., Mia Farrow, and dozens of others who all seem to be in different movies. There's a death that happens early on that everyone ignores, which is supposed to be satirical, but mostly feels cruel. Audiences in 1978 wanted structure and payoff, not cinema verite about wealthy people having a bad party. Altman's style works brilliantly in Nashville because that film has momentum and purpose. But A Wedding feels like he's repeating himself without understanding what made the earlier film successful. It represents the worst of 70s auteur indulgence, assuming audiences will accept anything as long as it's unconventional. They didn't, and the movie disappeared quickly, rarely discussed even by Altman fans who prefer to forget it exists. Number 3. The Reincarnation of Peter Proud, 1975. This supernatural thriller about a man haunted by memories of a past life and his eventual murder should have been creepy and thought-provoking, but instead audiences found it boring and deeply uncomfortable. Michael Sarrazin plays Peter Proud, who has vivid nightmares about being killed and becomes obsessed with finding out who he was in his previous life. When he tracks down his former wife, now elderly, and his daughter, now middle-aged, things get deeply weird as he begins a romantic relationship with the daughter, which is essentially dating his own child from a past life. Audiences were repulsed by the implications, and critics called it tasteless and poorly thought out. The movie tries to be a serious exploration of reincarnation, but ends up feeling exploitative and creepy in all the wrong ways. There's zero chemistry between the leads, and watching Sarrazin obsess over proving his past life identity becomes tedious quickly. The ending offers no real resolution, just more questions and a sense that you've wasted 2 hours on something fundamentally unpleasant. The film made some money but was quickly forgotten, becoming a footnote in 70s supernatural cinema. What makes it hated is how it takes an interesting premise and handles it in the most off-putting way possible. The production values are fine, the acting is competent, but the core story has a rot at its center that no amount of craft can fix. It feels like a TV movie with delusions of profundity, and audiences rejected it for good reason. Nobody wanted to think too hard about the ethics of reincarnation, leading to basically dating your own offspring. Number 2. The Cassandra Crossing, 1976. This disaster thriller involves terrorists, a plague, and a train full of passengers being deliberately sent to their deaths by covering up a biological weapon leak, and it's every bit as messy as that description suggests. With an all-star cast including Sophia Loren, Richard Harris, Ava Gardner, Burt Lancaster, and O.J. Simpson, the movie should have been a prestige thriller. Instead, it's a plotting, illogical mess where characters make insane decisions and the plot holes are visible from space. The premise involves infected passengers on a train being rerouted to cross a bridge that everyone knows is unstable and will collapse, killing everyone, to prevent the plague from spreading. Audiences hated how stupid everyone acts, from the military covering up the outbreak to the passengers who somehow don't figure out they're being murdered until the final act. The movie cost $6 million and made decent money in Europe, but was savaged by American critics who called it insulting to viewers' intelligence. There's a scene where characters debate what to do while the train barrels towards certain death, and you're screaming at the screen for them to just stop the train. The special effects when the bridge collapses are laughably bad, with obvious miniatures and rear projection that looks cheap even by 70s television standards. What truly makes the Cassandra Crossing hated is how it wastes its incredible cast on material that feels like it was written in a weekend. Lancaster looks bored. Gardner seems confused about what movie she's in, and Harris is clearly collecting a paycheck. It's the kind of disaster movie that makes you root for the disaster because at least then something interesting would happen. Number 1. Brass Target, in 1978. This conspiracy thriller suggests General Patton was assassinated by American forces to cover up a gold heist, and it's somehow even more boring than that description implies. Sophia Loren, George Kennedy, Robert Vaughn, Patrick McGoohan, and Max von Sydow star in a convoluted mess that takes a genuinely interesting premise and buries it under terrible pacing and nonsensical plot developments. The movie cost $10 million and made almost nothing, disappearing from theaters within weeks and leaving audiences who did see it baffled and angry. Critics were brutal, with most suggesting the film insults both Patton's memory and viewers' time. What makes Brass Target the most hated movie of the decade is how thoroughly it fails at everything it attempts. The action sequences are poorly staged, the mystery is obvious from the first act, and the performances are uniformly flat. Von Sydow plays the assassin with all the menace of someone filing taxes, and Loren is completely wasted in a nothing role that feels added just to have a woman in the cast. There are long stretches where characters explain the plot to each other, which is death for a thriller. The film tries to be a serious political conspiracy drama, but has no idea how to build tension or create compelling characters. Audiences felt actively angry that they'd been tricked into watching something this incompetent. The title Brass Target sounds exciting, promising action and intrigue, but delivers neither. It represents the absolute nadir of 70s conspiracy thrillers, taking what All the President's Men and The Parallax View did brilliantly and misunderstanding every single element. The movie isn't just bad, it's aggressively boring, which might be the worst sin a thriller can commit. Nobody talks about Brass Target today because even hate requires some level of passion, and this film generates only apathy and regret. These 14 films prove that even Hollywood's golden decade of creative freedom could produce absolute disasters that audiences rightfully despised. Some have been re-evaluated over time, finding cult followings or critical redemption, but most remain exactly what they were in the 70s, expensive mistakes that wasted talent and money. Which of these films do you think deserves its hated status, and which might be due for a second look? More importantly, what's the worst movie you've ever sat through in a theater, and did you demand your money back? Drop your most hated film experience in the comments and defend your choice like the movie personally offended your ancestors.